Has the Bible that we have today been altered or corrupted? We have no original autographs, and that's just a fancy way of saying no original manuscripts that were penned by the authors. All we have are copies of copies, and in some cases of copies, made over the years. So can we trust the Bible specifically regarding its preservation and translation? It's an interesting question. How do we know that there hasn't been significant changes or errors made in the process of copying? How do we know that there hasn't been some collusion where some people who all possessed the only copies that were left of certain passages got together and schemed to deceive people by changing what the Word says? It's not uncommon to hear comments and statements such as, well, the Bible was corrupted by the Catholic Church who possessed it. That type of a comment is made by, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons. They will say that the Bible is corrupted and that they have the real Bible that God revealed to other people because the Catholic Church had corrupted the Bible. But by the same token, the Catholic Church will say that only those Bibles designated as approved by Catholicism are acceptable. Any other ones are not acceptable, since the Church, the Catholic Church that is, possesses the oldest copies. Yet is it possible to have confidence in the Bible, that it contains the Scriptures as they were originally written, that it is free from attempts to twist and distort the Scriptures to support a particular church or doctrine? Well, over the next several Sunday nights, we're going to ask the question, can we trust the Bible? And we're going to see if what we have is what God intended or if it's been messed up by man. I believe, though, that we can trust the Bible. And this confidence comes from keeping two things in mind, specifically regarding its preservation and translation, and that is textual evidence for the biblical documents, and second, translation guidelines for selecting a translation of the Bible. We're going to talk about those two things this evening. First, let's start by talking about some textual evidence. And we'll start, of course, with the Old Testament. What textual evidence exists that the Old Testament is as it should be, is as it was intended to be? Well, look at these things called the Masoretic text, which date back to around 900 AD, maybe back to the 7th century to the 10th century, somewhere in that general time frame. But these are the earliest copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. They were copied by Jewish scribes called the Masoretes. You know, that's who the documents are named after. If you compare their texts with earlier manuscripts that were written in Greek and Latin, etc., you find that it reveals very careful copying with very little deviation during the 1,000 or so years from 100 BC to 900 AD. You also have another Old Testament textual evidence is the Dead Sea Scrolls. You probably have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered in 1947 containing copies of Old Testament books dating back to 100 BC. All the way through 70 AD is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were composed. They were discovered in 1947. Compared with the earlier text, the Masoretic text, they confirm very careful copying of Jewish scribes over that 1,000 or so year period. And finally, we have the Septuagint, written 200 BC. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It put the Old Testament into the Greek language. It was done by about 70 scholars or so in 200 BC. It also confirms the accuracy of the copyists who gave us that Masoretic text. That is pretty much the basis for the Bible that we have today. In his book, Can I Trust My Bible?, R. Laird Harris concludes, we can now be sure that the copyist worked with great care and accuracy on the Old Testament, even back to 225 BC. Indeed, it would be rash skepticism that would now deny that we have our Old Testament in a form very close to that used by Ezra when he taught the word of the Lord to those who had returned from the Babylonian captivity. So for the Old Testament, we've got these three textual evidences, apparatuses, if you will, that all confirm, and you take them all together, and they confirm that the Old Testament is very likely, more likely than not, in fact, I would say definitely what God had in mind when Moses and the others penned the Old Testament. What about for the New Testament, though? For the New Testament, we want to take a slightly different approach. First, we look at the number of manuscripts. There are, in existence, over 4,000 Greek manuscripts taken from the New Testament. 4,000. There are 1,300 copies of portions of the New Testament in Greek. That is substantial when you're dealing with what some would call an archaic book. That is a substantial number of manuscripts that we have for the New Testament. We also could look at the location of the manuscripts, where they were discovered, where they were found. They were found in various places: Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, Greece, Italy. Basically, they were found all over the Roman world, the world at the time, the world that was known at the time. This is important because this shows that collusion would have been extremely difficult. I mean, if you have a manuscript that was discovered in say in Palestine, and it says one thing, and you have another manuscript that was discovered in Rome, Italy, and it says exactly the same thing or pretty close to it as that other document, as that other manuscript, that shows that collusion, secretly getting together to conspire to change what it says, would be extremely difficult. Because it wasn't a question of just, okay, well, we got this thing digitally, so we'll go online and we'll change it, and no one will know any different. It's not like Wikipedia, where anyone could edit it or alter it or whatever. It couldn't work that way because of the time in which they were discovered. Besides that, they weren't just discovered in one church or one religious body that contained all of them. They were found in different places, in different religions, if you will. The number of the manuscripts, the location of the manuscripts, also the date of the manuscripts is quite impressive. Several papyri fragments have been dated to within 50 to 100 years of the original documents. You might say, but that's 50 or 100 years later. Yes, and that's very exciting and very impressive. They may be copies of copies, but they date very closely to the original documents and manuscripts. We have several nearly complete New Testament Greek manuscripts that date to 300 to 400 years after the New Testament was completed. And I say it again, but that's 300 to 400 years. Or when we're talking about books written in that time period as the Bible, that is extraordinarily impressive. For example, of these nearly complete New Testament Greek manuscripts, there's the Codex Sinaiticus found near Mount Sinai. There is the Codex Alexandrinus found near Alexandria in Egypt, and the Codex Vaticanus located at the Vatican in Rome. So the dating of the manuscripts that we have is very impressive. There is also to take into consideration the variations of the manuscripts. People are very fond of saying, well, the Bible contradicts itself. It says one thing in one place and something different in another place. And it doesn't. Trust me, it doesn't. In fact, many times if somebody goes in to the Bible, their study of the Bible with the intent of proving the contradictions, if they have a good and an honest heart, they come away realizing that the Bible does not contradict itself. But what about the earliest manuscripts? What about them? What if they have? Well, the vast majority of differences in these manuscripts are very minor. It might be a spelling or differences in phraseology, things of that nature. The cat is black, the black cat. That sort of difference. You know, it doesn't really make any difference one way or the other. Modern translations often note these differences in the footnotes. And people say, well, you know, the footnote says it could read this. Well, that doesn't really necessarily change the meaning of what is being said. In fact, when you're talking about the New Testament, as far as passages that are in question, there is 0.5% of passages in the New Testament are in question. 0.5%. You said, but that's significant. That's enough to cast doubt on the New Testament. Actually, it's not. There's another fairly popular book that, it's popular in high school anyway, that was written after the New Testament, but in the same general time period, called the Iliad by Homer. Nobody would dare to question the authenticity of the Iliad, and yet there is a full 5% of passages in the Iliad that are called into question. 5%. The New Testament, 0.5%. Even then, even taking into account that 0.5%, it can still be stated, no fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain. Especially is this the case with the New Testament. That's a quote from Sir Frederick Kenyon, who is an authority in the field of New Testament textual criticism. Now, one passage that always comes up if you talk about manuscript differences and everything is Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. Because many times we take people to that to point out to them the necessity of baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And they are very quick to jump on the fact that, well, what about this little thing up here? It says the earliest and most reliable manuscripts do not contain Mark 16, 9 through 20. How do you explain that? And how does that go with what Sir Frederick Kenyon, this authority in New Testament textual criticism, says, that no fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed passage? That's a disputed passage. It talks about baptism. Yes, it does. But you know what? So does Matthew 28, 19 and 20. So does Acts 2, verse 38. So does Acts 22:16. So do so many other passages mention baptism, talk about baptism, what its purpose is for the forgiveness of sins, how it is to be done by immersion. So many other passages talk about it that if we didn't even take into account Mark 16, 9 through 20, we still could show that baptism is a requisite to having your sins forgiven. You could also look at other translations of the manuscripts, not just the ones that are translated into English, but other languages. For example, there are more than 1,000 copies and fragments in Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Gothic, and Ethiopic languages. 8,000 copies of the Latin Vulgate, some almost dating back to Jerome's original translation, which was sometime around 400 AD. So we look at other translations that came from these manuscripts, and we find out that they're all pretty much in order and in line. And we also have the writings of the early church fathers from 100 to 400 AD. You say, well, I've heard that phrase, church fathers. What does that actually mean? I mean, who were the church fathers? Well, the church fathers were early religious leaders who wrote and left thousands of quotations of the New Testament in their writings. They lived from 100 to 400 AD. Even if all of the New Testament manuscripts and translations were to disappear overnight, let's say they were all being stored in a museum somewhere and the museum was destroyed. Even if that were to happen to all of the manuscripts and translations that we have, it would be possible to reconstruct the New Testament from the quotations of the early church fathers, with the possible exception of 15 to 20 verses. That's pretty significant, I think. The evidence is sufficient to show that the Greek New text of the New Testament has been faithfully preserved without the possibility of collusion or corruption by any one religious party or faction. That's significant. You're probably thinking, well, why? Why are we talking about this? Well, because there are a lot of people out there who doubt the authenticity of the Bible. How do you know that there are a lot of people out there that doubt the authenticity of the Bible? Well, I was telling you a couple of months ago about this little thing we're doing called 12 Questions NWA, 12 Questions Northwest Arkansas, for the area-wide service that we have in October. We're taking the top 12 questions, and there's going to be sermons or lessons presented on them. And though it didn't make the top 4, so it's not going to be presented live, one of the top 12 questions from everyone in Northwest Arkansas who asked questions on that website concerned, how do we know we have the Bible for real? How do we know the Bible that we have is accurate? It deals with this particular subject. And so it's important that we understand that the text of the Bible has been preserved in its original languages. And while that is true, how can we be sure that the version we use is faithful in its translation of the text? Well, let me share with you now a few translation guidelines that you might want to use as you look at and consider each of the different translations that are out there. I want to caution you about a couple types of translations. First of all, beware of those by one individual. This isn't always the case. Dr. Hugo McCord published what he called his translation of the Everlasting Gospel. It's basically, he translated the New Testament from Greek to English. And Dr. McCord, I narrowly missed having Dr. McCord as a professor at Oklahoma Christian. I'll never forgive myself for not being born about 10 years earlier. Okay? Then I would have had him as a professor. It would have been great. But I wasn't able to. But he does a very good job. Even people who are not of our faith, people who are not members of the Church of Christ, compliment him on his translation of the New Testament. So, there are exceptions to this. But generally speaking, a translation that was done by just one individual is something to be avoided. For example, the Living Bible was translated by Kenneth Taylor. And it's not really a translation at all. Okay? It's a paraphrase. What you might say he did was he took some of the older versions and translations of the Bible and translated them into modern English. He didn't necessarily go back to the original documents or as original as he could. But anyway, so though well-intentioned, such translations often express the views of that one person, his biases, and they convey the theological bias of that individual. Instead of a translation by just one individual, it's better to find those produced by a committee of people, and the more people that are on the committee, the better. A committee of scholars with often hundreds of experts in Hebrew and in Greek who examine and critique each other's work in the translation so that that whole idea of collusion or of bias is taken out of the picture. So beware of those by one individual. Also beware of those by a denomination or a particular denomination. Some translations are the work of one religious group. For example, the New World Translation. That is the production of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, they say that is the authoritative version, and it is, they say you can use the King James, but they would prefer that you use the New World Translation, and it is slanted to prove doctrines that are favorable to their group. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, the New World Translation of John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the NIV, John 1, 1 and 2 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning." If you were to look that up in the New World Translation, it would say, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God." He was with God in the beginning. Now, that's just one letter. Yes, it's just one letter, but it changes what the text says. It changes it to slant it towards what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe about Christ. That He was not eternally God, that there is no such thing as the Trinity, and that instead Jesus was the first creation of God. And that He was, as such, He was not created as a God, but as a spiritual being who eventually worked His way to becoming a God. And so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. Just one letter, but it changes the meaning. You also could consider Colossians 1, 16 and 17. Let me read it to you out of the English Standard Version. Colossians 1, 16 and 17 says this, "For by Him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through Him and for Him. And He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together." Now, if you look at that verse in the New World Translation, they insert the word "other" 4 times. Okay, here's how it reads in the New World Translation. Because by means of him all other things were created in the heavens and upon the earth. The things visible and the things invisible, no matter whether they are thrones or lordships or governments or authorities, all other things have been created through him and for him. Also, he is before all other things, and by means of him all other things were made to exist. That word other, it's just one word, but it changes what the text says. It's better instead to find those produced by representatives from different backgrounds, where the scholars aren't just from one denomination, one church organization or what have you. Members of different religious organizations who check each other's work to prevent theological biases. So we've talked a little bit about how to choose it and avoid those by one individual or those put out by a denomination. So what are some for lack of a better term, some recommended English translations? Well, you have the New International Version, which is what for the last 24 years has been my personal choice for preaching. It's easy to read. I'm familiar with it. I memorized things out of it as I was growing up. First came out in, I believe, 1978 or so, and so I've memorized some things. I'm currently in the process of possibly switching over to the English Standard Version. Got this yesterday. It's a lot heavier than my other one was. I don't know, but anyway. But not because of anything bad with the NIV, just because it's closer to a word-for-word translation than the NIV is. Some would say the NIV is prone to theological biases of the translation committee. That the translation committee was too close on a theological scale, and so therefore their biases are evident from in the NIV. But quite honestly, I know enough Greek. I'm not a scholar by any means, but I know enough Greek to know that there is no perfect translation. So even before now, I didn't always just stick with one translation, one version, when I was preparing lessons and so forth. Always look at a variety of them. Of course, you could also look at the King James Version, which some see as the only translation. Any others are not acceptable. They see the King James Version is the authorized version. It says it on the title page. But the one who did the authorizing was King James, not God, okay? That's why it's the authorized by King James in 1611. It's a classic, but it is somewhat archaic in the words that are used. In fact, many people have problems with or misunderstand the Old English that is used in the King James Version. So, they came out with the New King James Version. The New King James Version is an updated King James Version, desiring to preserve the beauty of the King James Version. Easier to read than the King James Version. Some archaic words have been replaced with more modern words. Some archaic words remain, but maybe in a footnote or something it'll tell you what it is intended to mean in Old English, so that it eliminates some of the confusion. There's also the American Standard Version, or the ASV as it's known. The American Standard Version is known as the most literal to the Greek. But because it is the most literal to the Greek, it is also perhaps the hardest to understand. Because Greeks have different sentence structure. And so you have to be aware of that, because the most important word in the sentence will always be put first, and then other words, and it's difficult to know which order the words are supposed to go in English anyway, so as to make the most sense. The American Standard Version is almost out of print as well. In fact, if you would like an entire Old Testament and New Testament of the American Standard Version, be ready to shell out between $150 and $175. It's that out of print. Okay, New Testament for the only of the American Standard is a little bit easier, more easy to find, and you can find one for a little bit more reasonable cost. But again, it had some of those words. 1901 it came out, so it has some of those words that have changed in meaning and so forth. So enter the New American Standard. This is an update to the American Standard. It can often be seen as wordy and thus difficult to read, especially if you're trying to read it in public. So you take that into consideration. Also, the New American Bible. The New American Bible is actually another one of those that is approved for Catholics. I said, wait a second. You said these are recommended English translations. Yeah, I'm not saying you want to use this all the time. But if you ever have a chance to study with a Catholic, you can use the New American Bible, and it's useful to show doctrine, differences in doctrine are not due to translation. Okay? Because it says some of the same stuff, some of it's a little different, don't misunderstand me, but the primary difference there is it contains the Apocrypha. Okay? Whereas our Bible has the Old Testament and the New Testament. Catholic Bibles between the Old and New Testament have the Apocrypha, intertestamental books. And of course, there are many, many others. The Revised Standard Version, Contemporary English Version, the English Standard Version, others that have been released lately that are good. Some are not good, like the TNIV, the Today's New International Version. It too is more of a paraphrase and is not as true to the original texts. The Message, catchy title, The Message. Ooh, sounds good, but it's a paraphrase, and thus you probably don't want to rely too much on it. But this is what's called a translation meter. Types of Bible translations, and I actually have it for you on the back of your sermon notes. It starts over here with the word for word, and of course this first word right here is interlinear. What does that mean? That means it has the English and the Greek in it. Okay? That probably wouldn't be of much interest or use to people who haven't ever studied Greek. I have an interlinear New Testament in my office. I don't use it a whole lot, but I have it, okay? Just so I can press flowers with it and papers and things. I'm just kidding. The point is that if you want to go literally word for word, the interlinear is the one you want to get. You want to get one, it has the Greek word, it has the English word right underneath it. And then it goes on word for word, which is good or better, and then there's thought for thought. The NIV would fit in the thought for thought category. It's not as ideal, but it still is pretty good, all the way over to paraphrases, which you probably, be very careful when you're using one that is considered a paraphrase. And maybe not even use it at all. But anyway, can we trust the Bible? Yes, we can trust the Bible, because the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, though copies, have been providentially preserved. 2 Peter 1 verse 3 tells us about the providence of God giving us everything we need for life and godliness. Everything we need for life and godliness is right here in the Word of God. Though different translations, all reputable translations, can teach the truth. Yes, it is possible to have confidence in the Bible, confidence that it contains the Scriptures as they were originally written, confidence that it can be read without fear that it has been tainted to support a particular church or doctrine. We can trust the Bible. Do you trust the Bible? James 1:21 and 22 says, "Therefore get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." The Bible is not just a great novel, a great story that you read and you think, "Oh, that was such a good story." And then you go on your way. The Bible is meant to be read and to impact and, in fact, alter the course of your life. It is meant to be read so as to change your thoughts on certain things, certain issues. It is meant to be read so that it changes your eternal destiny. I hope that's how you view the Bible. Not as just a great book that was written thousands of years ago, but as a book of eternal importance. Because that's what it is. And over the next 6 or so weeks, we're going to explore whether or not it truly is worthy of being called a book of eternal significance, or if it's just a book that was written a long time ago that has nothing to say to us today. One of the things the Bible does teach us about, though, is about God's love for us. About God's love for us that was so great that He would send Jesus to die on the cross for us, so that we could live for Him. Are you living for Him? If not, I would encourage you to make whatever change is necessary. Maybe that change is simply a private change. Maybe it's a public change. But don't leave here tonight the same as you were when you came. Allow God's Word to work on your heart. Allow God's Word to change your heart. If we can help you in some way through a public response, won't you let us know about that by coming to the front now as we stand and sing together.